Boogaloo boys, as they're often called, are people who want to see chaos happen, who would like to see a civil war. So, whereas Proud Boys and Three Percenters might be the sorts of people who would like, the Proud Boys aggressively want to push this male centric society. Three Percenters are saying, we're going to be ready when something happens in society that is, some big cataclysm. Boogaloo Boys would like to incite that.
Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Do you remember 2016? I know that was a long time ago at this point. It probably feels like decades. Well, that was a presidential election year, but before the presidential election, early on in 2016, a big story captivated the country, and particularly the Northwest. That was the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. And now, again, 4 years later, we have a big global story happening that's captivating us before the presidential election. And suddenly, that 2016 story has some relevance again today, 4 years later. And here to talk a little bit about it is journalist Leah Sottile, host of the Bundyville podcast. Thanks for joining us today, Leah.
Thanks for having me.
So, Leah, before we talk about the Bundyville podcast and some of the stuff that you've covered on the anti-government movement, I first, though, want to talk about Antifa. That is an organization and a word we've heard a lot in the last several weeks, frankly, as the protests for racial justice have been ongoing. It's been on the lips of people like Attorney General William Barr and President Trump himself. A lot of people have heard the name Antifa. It supposedly means anti-fascist. But from your perspective, what, or really who, is Antifa?
Antifa is, like you said, it's just shorthand for anti-fascist. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what people who are Antifa or anti-fascists are. And a lot of that comes from in the past 4 years, we've seen tons of protests happening in places like Portland, where I live, where Antifa is sort of rumbling in the streets with Proud Boys and these sort of far right people. What I've come to learn in covering those things is that Antifa can take all sorts of shades of look and feel. Anybody who's opposed to fascism is anti-fascist. And a lot of times people think that Antifa are these people dressed in all black with, a black face mask and black clothing and busting up windows and getting into fights. In some interviews that I have done with anti-fascist groups, they talk about that as called black bloc. That's the term for that style of clothing. Black bloc is just 1% of the anti-fascist movement. And that is used as a tactic by anti-fascists to protect normal, everyday anti-fascist protesters. So that's how it's framed. I think that in the media, there's been a lot of portrayal of, these people getting in fights and things like that. I think that really it is just sort of this kind of very small group that is committing violence, but that's what's being picked up on to sort of propagate these rumors that these vans full of Antifa are coming to your town to destroy things, which have been wholeheartedly disproven.
Indeed, and in some cases, it's been shown that it was anti-government or far right-wing groups who were pretending to be Antifa or putting messages on social media to sort of play up that angle and that rumor. So interesting dynamics there. I want to move on a little bit to the Bundyville podcast, your work over the last several years. Seasons 1 and 2 of that, of course, delved into the anti-government movement and the militia movement. And I wonder if people might have thought some of that went away in the 90s after Ruby Ridge and then, of course, the Oklahoma City bombing several years later. And maybe we didn't really hear much about that sort of movement for a long time. I wonder, though, from your perspective and your research on this, did it ever really go away, or are we just hearing about it more because of our internet connected world and we just see those sorts of things more often now and it never really was gone?
Yeah, it wasn't gone. I think that you really saw numbers dip off after the Oklahoma City bombing, that there was this sort of big violent thing with this huge death toll, and people really kind of backed away from that. However, under the Obama years, we saw militia numbers really rising again. So it definitely didn't go away. I think you do hit on something really interesting, though. Militias in the 90s really were only able to flourish by, people going to gun shows and sort of handing off literature and flyers and recruiting people through these face-to-face interactions. Now with social media, it's just much more easy for people to get together and meet people they wouldn't typically meet that are outside of their area, their town. So we are seeing numbers again, I think, go up. I don't have a sense of if this is like if militia numbers are higher than they are in the 90s. I would doubt that, but we did see them really going up under Obama. And of course, there are a lot of things happening right now that are kind of things that militias have been talking about for a long time. So it wouldn't surprise me if we're seeing more numbers.
So, moving into the actual namesake of the Bundyville podcast, Cliven Bundy, of course, the father figure, and Ammon and Ryan Bundy, his sons, who were at the center of the Malheur refuge occupation in Oregon. Cliven Bundy, of course, was at the center of his own standoff with the federal government at his ranch in Nevada in 2014. That case ultimately ended in a mistrial in Las Vegas. But now the federal government is bringing the case against Cliven Bundy back, which I will frankly say surprised me and probably surprised a lot of people. I just wonder if you, as a journalist who's covered this very closely, was at all surprised, considering that the federal government under President Trump has been generally more friendly to ranching interests. In fact, President Trump pardoned the Hammond family, Dwight and Stephen, whose case was at the center of the Malheur occupation that really sparked it. And now the federal government, on the other hand, is bringing the case against Cliven Bundy back. What are some of the dynamics there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When Cliven Bundy and his sons were, when that trial ended in a mistrial, it was dismissed with prejudice, which means that the government could not bring charges again. So what we're seeing right now is that those prosecutors are appealing it in the Court of Appeals to say, that was way too harsh. And they admitted in a hearing at the end of May, there was so much evidence in the case that perhaps they didn't disclose everything that they needed to. But their argument was that it didn't have much of a malicious intent behind it. The attorneys for the Bundys were saying that they would welcome another trial because they felt that they didn't get to introduce a lot of evidence that they thought was really damning of the government. So did it surprise me? A little, but I think also you have to think about that Cliven Bundy has been grazing his cattle on federal land for more than 20 years, and that when they tried to round up that cattle in 2014, they were met with 100 plus people with guns, and I think it really set a precedent for people that they knew, well, if we bring enough firepower, we could probably get the government to back down, and that's just not a good look. So so for that reason, I could see them wanting to bring charges again. Plus, we're now seeing news out of Bunkerville that Ryan Bundy is building new water infrastructure on land right now. It's not like they thought, okay, we got out of here pretty scot-free. Let's try and keep a low profile. Like, they are definitely aggressively trying to build things on federal land still. So I think that the government knows they need to do something.
So we are, of course, right now in a very interesting time, having seen the coronavirus measures being put into place and many people protesting against those measures over the last several months, including Ammon Bundy himself. He's done several high-profile events in Idaho against the measures, particularly against Governor Brad Little. So I just wonder, in this time of a lot of this sort of reaction against governmental intervention and lockdowns and those sorts of things, if that has really played into the hands of people like the Bundys, who have for years been saying the government is too powerful, particularly the federal government. They're reining us in, they're trampling over our rights, these sorts of things. And have they now kind of just been saying, see, right, we were right all along. It's sort of government tyranny. You should have been listening to us.
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, I think that Ammon Bundy's reaction it was unsurprising for a lot of reasons. I think the one difference, like you said, they've been very anti-federal government, but in this case, we saw a lot of people within the Patriot movement being very anti-state government against their state governors. Particularly Bundy, before Easter, he was calling the stay-at-home orders martial law. And when you listen to people within the Patriot movement, a lot of their leaders and militias, you know that martial law is like the end-all be-all fear, that they are afraid that at some point in the future, martial law will happen, the Constitution will be suspended, and then, any number of apocalyptic scenarios could play out. But Bundy was saying, this is happening. He set up a de facto church against the governor's stay-at-home orders, and really the pastor at the church and him were basically preaching about martial law and about why you should resist the stay-at-home orders, and them being such a great example of a tyrannical government. And you can really look all around the West. Pretty much every Western state has had some sort of rally against the stay-at-home orders and things like that.
A lot of what you covered in Bundyville, particularly the second season, dealt with anti-government extremism more broadly outside of just the Bundy family's beliefs. And in particular, in the Northwest, Washington state lawmaker Matt Shea was famously a part of that, and he was featured very prominently in season 2 of Bundyville. One thing you honed in on was this church movement in northeastern Washington that latched with the Christian identity movement that had some overtones of white nationalism and white supremacy. Is that a fair characterization of what some of those beliefs are?
So the second season was definitely like really trying to draw on historical connections between the current patriot movement and the past. And Matt Shea was somebody that really we wanted to examine because he was expressing beliefs that had been expressed before by Richard Butler at the Aryan Nations, but kind of repackaging them and rebranding them. So while Shea is not somebody who may be overtly white nationalist, however, I guess he is very anti-Muslim. Um, he's just kind of taking these old ideas and bringing them to right now. So with Christian identity, I mean, that's a movement that has its roots in white nationalist groups. It's a belief system where people who adhere to it believe that white British people are the lost tribes of Israel. It's a very anti-Semitic religion where they think that Jewish people are evil. That certainly has some relevance today, especially in the Northwest.
So I want to go back to the Antifa rumors of before. A lot of the armed groups that have come out in response to those rumors, those many of which are debunked, have done so under the banner of they're there to keep the peace,
Mm.
protect the protesters, but also protect the cities and towns from rampant looting and violence and those sorts of things. And they've said that they're just being there to protect others. And one of the things that has come up is the involvement of groups like the Proud Boys, Three Percenters, Boogaloos. These are words and names of groups that people have heard more in the last several weeks that they probably haven't really maybe heard before. And I just wonder if you could draw some distinctions between those groups and provide some of the background on what those groups really are.
So the Proud Boys are one that you hear a lot of people kind of group these people together as all Proud Boys. Proud Boys, generally, they're, neo-fascists. It's an all-male organization. They perceive anything that's politically correct or that expresses some sort of white guilt as something that they want to fight against, and quite literally fight against. So like in Portland in the last 4 years, we've seen lots of these Proud Boy groups coming to town to just sort of oppose this rampant liberalism. In Three Percenters and militia groups, they are similar but different. They have anti-government ideologies. This name 3% is conspiracy theory that people who belong to the group believe in. They believe that it only took 3% of American colonists to fight off the British during the American Revolution, which is, wholeheartedly disproven. Both groups, I think, are often called white nationalist groups, but that is pretty reductive in that there are many people of color that are Proud Boys, many people of color who are 3%ers. However, they sort of stand on ideas that, again, are like rebranded ideas that come from white nationalist movements or, neo-Nazi talking points and things like that. Boogaloo, again, is a new term that I guess I never thought I would have to learn a lot about, but here we are. Boogaloo boys, as they're often called, are people who want to see chaos happen, who would like to see a civil war. So whereas Proud Boys and Three Percenters might be the sorts of people who would the Proud Boys aggressively want to push this male-centric society. Three Percenters are saying, we're going to be ready when something happens in society that is, some big cataclysm. Boogaloo Boys would like to incite that. So we've seen over the last week several instances of Boogaloo Boys showing up at either Black Lives Matter protests or getting into confrontations with police officers and killing police officers in some instances as a way of trying to just sort of wreak havoc and chaos. And the end game there is really sort of like nihilism instead of like a refounding of society.
I'm a little curious about what I might simply call the Venn diagram overlap of some of the ideologies we've been talking about, or some of the people who are perhaps more like Ammon Bundy, but
Mhm.
then on the other side, the people who are very strong uh, proponents of police, both at the local, state, and federal level. So what I mean by that is Ammon Bundy and the type of people who are a part of his ideology, you might say are pretty libertarian. They want small government. They want to have less federal government involved. They've kind of pushed against that. And so you might say that they are probably maybe not big fans of large state and federal police forces and police actions as they involve how they interact with citizens. But on the
Yeah,
other side,
absolutely.
you also have, of course, many people in this current moment of protest who are big fans or defenders of police and say we need strong police forces at local, county, state, and federal levels in order to keep the peace, right? 'Cause law and order. So I just wonder what your sense of like someone like Ammon Bundy and his and followers in that sort of ideology, how they might feel about large state and federal police forces in this moment.
Yeah, well, specifically, I mean, I've looked at some of the things that Ammon Bundy has been talking about on his social media, and he's absolutely, seeing this as a moment that he can say, "Yeah, I agree. I think that the police have way too much power. Look at what the amount of force they brought on us at Bundy Ranch." They often point to the 2016 Malheur occupation and the death of Lavoy Finicum as another instance of police force overreach. Um, it's a little bit opportunistic, I think, to capitalize on this moment. But if the bunnies are nothing but opportunists in a lot of my reporting, um, so I think that is one distinction. But however, if you look at the long history of the Patriot movement and a lot of people who've adhered to this, you've got under that umbrella of the Patriot movement sovereign citizens who are people who very actively oppose police and any kind of law enforcement and there are multiple times in history that they have gotten into large shootouts with police officers for very simple things like a driver's license or a license plate. So within the patriot movement, it's hard to cast it with a broad brush because there are people who are very pro law enforcement, pro Trump, things like that. Ammon Bundy is not those things. So this is just to say there's a lot of nuance in it.
Certainly there is, and that's why journalists like yourself are out there to help bring us some of the context around that nuance. So my last question, of course, you've probably been asked this a lot recently, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you one more time. Season 3 of Bundyville, is it now possible given everything that's happened over the last few months?
I wish it was, but I have been reluctant to say whether or not we were going to do anything else because I had lots of ideas for it. But no, we are not planning on any more Bundyville. And I guess I will take this as a moment to say that this is symptomatic of the media industry right now. That Longreads, who is the primary funder of that, has done lots of layoffs and big budget cuts, and we're seeing that since COVID across the board with media. So I will certainly be continue to covering this stuff, but it won't be for Bundyville.
Well, no matter how you cover it, we anxiously and appreciatively look forward to seeing all your coverage. Leah Sottile, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You can see more of Leah's reporting on these and other topics at High Country News, that's hcn.org. And for seasons 1 and 2 of Bundyville, find that in Apple Podcasts and Google Play. And for more Northwest news, come to our website, nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.